and the apostate. And the difference is that the heretic espouses views that are non-normative or unconventional, but uses them very often to reconstruct a new form of Judaism out of that non-normativity. The apostate converts to another religion. The apostate leaves completely. The apostate doesn't threaten Jews. The apostate kind of moves on, except in one case, which I'll mention in a moment. But the apostate basically is not a threat to Judaism, because the apostate doesn't really claim to say anything new about Judaism. The heretic, what's dangerous about the heretic is not the non-normative views that he or she takes. What's dangerous about the heretic is the way in which they then try to reconstruct, recalibrate, reformulate Judaism in light of those heretical views. And in a certain sense, that becomes what is of interest to me as a scholar, not really that interested in the apostate. I'm really interested in the heretic and the role that the heretic plays. And what does that actually mean to engage in a project of heresy as a constructive Jewish project at a time when heresy no longer maintains any kind of label of erasure or exclusion, and that the Jewish community really has no operative way to police that heresy. So if you're excommunicated from a synagogue, you just can go around the block to another synagogue. Right. And that was true with Spinoza too. Spinoza could have gone to Italy, and he could have gone to a synagogue in Italy, and he would have been able to become part of that community. It was only in the community of Amsterdam because the rabbis were regionally limited in terms of their ability to engage in that project. So I want to take that, and then I want to talk a moment about Avera Lishma. Because I think Avera Lishma may be one tool, ideational tool to use to think about the reconstruction of Judaism from a heretical imperative, from those people who leave the normative Jewish world in which they were raised. Now, one could also just ask the question, and I don't really have an answer to this, but one could certainly ask the question, if there's no heresy, is there normativity? Is there a normative Jewish community? Orthodoxy likes to think so by making the claim of normativity through the claim of authenticity. But that's only a self-affirmed claim that is not really agreed upon by most Jews. If we want to think of what is normative Judaism for most Jews, if we're speaking fully within the category of numbers, it's Reform Judaism. Because most Jews, Reform Judaism is the largest Jewish denomination in America. Only 10% of American Jews identify as being Orthodox. So it's kind of strange to make the claim of normativity when you make up 10% of the population. But that's the claim that's made. And everyone is perfectly, everyone can make any kind of claim they want. I mean, I guess that's the heretical imperative that we live in. So there's a category that is developed by Mordechai Kaplan, speaking of a modern-day 20th century heretic, that was called by Jack Cohn, his son-in-law, or Ira Eisenstadt, I think, originally, post-halakic. Now, post-halakic is basically a way of responding to Reform Judaism that by and large constructs Judaism outside of the obligatory nature of Jewish law through what became known in Germany and later in America as ethical monotheism. And much of Reform is really a product of this ethical monotheism, going back to the prophetic tradition that Jewish law was really a product of the times and has been outdated, and so on and so on. So Kaplan comes up and basically offers a sociological approach influenced by Emil Durkheim and others to say that, no, I actually think that ceremonies, acts, behaviors, rituals are integral to how a society identifies itself as different from societies around it. And so he basically develops this notion of folkways, halacha as folkways. That is, Jews do Jewish things together as Jews, and that's what makes a Jewish community. The difference between halacha and post-halacha for Kaplan is that post-halacha does not have an obligatory, it's not based on an obligatory category. One does not do what one does Jewishly because they are obligated by God to do it, because Kaplan didn't believe in a personal God. One does what one does Jewishly because that participates in Jewish life, the continuity of Jewish life. So I want to take that and I want to take it one step further and offer another model of post-halacha that I'm calling Avera Lishma, or sin for the sake of heaven, as a heretical act done for the sake of heaven. Now we know that Avera Lishma is a category within rabbinic literature in very particular kinds of cases where, for example, the famous passage in the Talmud that the breaking the law is the law's fulfillment. And the phrase breaking the law is the law's fulfillment usually revolves around the notion of pikuach nefesh, or to save a life. So if you're in a situation where somebody's life is in danger and you have to, desecrate the Sabbath in order to save their life, saving their life and desecrating the Sabbath is keeping the Sabbath. And if you choose to keep the Sabbath and not save the person's life, the Talmud calls you a chassid shoteh, a foolish, pious person, right? So there is this category of Avera Lishma, but Avera Lishma within the rabbinic corpus functions within the orbit of halachic discourse. And so I became interested in exploring Jewish law in the writings of Zalman Schachter Shalomi. He was not a Jewish renewal rabbi, the rabbi who constructed Jewish renewal. And he wants to basically offer a model, or my understanding of his understanding of Jewish law is making a model of Avera Lishma. And the Avera Lishma starts from a basic principle that halacha, as traditionally understood, and again, this is more complicated for the sake of time, I don't really have the ability to explore this at length, is really largely about two things. Avodas Hashem, serving God, answering to a divine call, and separating from the Gentiles. Right? The dietary laws are one example, but there are many other categories of law that are really about separating from the Gentile, creating a certain kind of particularistic view. So Schachter Shalomi, coming from Kaplan, and there's a real influence of Schachter Shalomi from Kaplan, how do you incorporate operationally the universalistic principles that are built into prophetic Judaism within the particularistic nature of halakha? And this becomes one way in which Avera Lishma functions. So the approach to Jewish practice is both humanistic and universalistic, as we know. But the way that the Avera Lishma of Schachter Shalomi is that halakha should no longer separate the Jew from the non-Jew, or the Jew from the world, but to create a planetary Judaism founded on the intense particularity of mitzvot turned outward toward the world and not inward away from the world. That notion of turning outward toward the world is an instantiation of Avera Lishma. If we understand that halakha functions to protect the Jew from the world, then using halakha as a tool to reach out to the world would itself be crossing boundaries. It would be a heretical move. It would be a case of Avera Lishma. I want to read something very quickly. to try to get at this. There's this notion that functions within Jewish pietistic literature that Isidore Tversky, who for many years was a professor of Jewish studies at Harvard, called meta-halakha. That somehow within the Orthodox framework, I'm going to read a quote from him. Somehow within the Orthodox framework, he writes as follows: the tension in halakha flows from the painful awareness that manifestation and essence sometimes drift apart, from the sober recognition that a carefully constructed, finely chiseled normative system cannot regularly reflect, refract, or energize interior, fluid, spiritual forces and motives. That as much as Orthodoxy views halakha as the sine qua non of Judaism, Tversky, as an Orthodox Jew, is acknowledging that there are times when Jews need to act in other ways. Now, he's not talking about acting outside of halakha. He's talking about acting more deeply inside of halakha. But I'm in a certain sense offering a heretical reading of his passage is to say that the moving inside of halakha as a meta-halachic impulse can also be moving outside of halakha as an avera lishma impulse. That somehow the structures itself need to break down in order for the Jews to be able to fulfill what needs to be fulfilled. This happens in many cases. I mean, the classic case that many of us know about is Rev Kook's Zionism. That the secular Jews who settled Israel, and I'll give you another example actually from Yisachar Tachtal, writing from Hungary in 1944 in an attic where he was eventually captured and killed, where he writes, and this is a Hungarian ultra-Orthodox Jew, even if the builders of the land in Israel in our days are committing sins, this is his words, and deliberately defying the will of God and not keeping the commandments, still God welcomes their actions of building the land with love and great affection. Months before he was captured by the Nazis and killed. Right. Rev Kook makes similar assertions. So we already have a case where you can see that for Tachtal and for Kook, Zionism is avera lishma from their perspective. They can't say that it's not transgressive, but they also can't say that it's against the will of God. And I think this is what Schachter Shalomi really tries to develop in trying to understand what a Jewish renewal what a post-halachic Jewish renewal life would be. And what I want to suggest in the context of this conference is that I think that this is part of what the OTD world can offer Judaism. It can offer it a constructive, pietistic notion of avera lishma. By owning the heresy, because the heresy is an imperative anyway, so it doesn't matter, right? We're all heretics, right? By owning the heresy and also arguing that Judaism itself is not being transgressed by the abrogation of the normative, but is being fulfilled by the transgression of the normative in order to create a new model of Jewish life. I think that's one way of capturing what Newell is about. So here's an interesting thing, guys. I want to end in just a few minutes. And this is the counterintuitive claim that he's making. Much of Judaism after the Holocaust was an attempt to rebuild, reconstruct, revive, create models of Jewish continuity and survival in light of the Nazi genocide. In a certain sense, Judaism closing the circle around itself in a variety of different ways in order to protect itself from the war against Jews in Europe. And Shakta Shalomi has a whole different view of the Holocaust. For him, the Holocaust was a sign that the Jews have to become more outward toward the world, more expansive, more embracing, that Judaism has to become a world religion and not a religion only for Jews. Now, he doesn't mean this to say that, everyone should practice Judaism. I mean, that's something that Mayor Stephen Wise, the founder of Reform Judaism, really argued that in a discussion about Reform Judaism joining together with Unitarianism, which was actually a real option in the 19th century. There was going to be a merger of the Unitarian Church and Reform Judaism. In a sermon, Wise says that he thinks that eventually American Christians will just become Reform Jews. He actually says this because he felt like everything that is true about Christianity in the Unitarian sense is Jewish, and everything that's false about Christianity is not Jewish. Right? Now, it didn't exactly happen that way, and this is not something that I think that that Shakta Shalomi is arguing, but he's basically making the claim. This is the heretical claim that there's a Jewish vision that presents an unhalachic idea that Jewish normative practice should be a way of softening barriers between spiritual, ethnic, and national identities rather than building them up. The goal here is to foster more global consciousness that is founded on diversity but allows for permeable boundaries. How can Jews become part of the world, not in a sociological way? How can Judaism become part of the world? And I think that's something that many people who come from inside the highly normative claims of authenticity and exit that world, they actually have the tools to be able to think about the heretical imperative in a constructive way to rebuild a Judaism after the Holocaust that is about embracing the world rather than protecting itself from it. Because I think we're in a moment of time today, September 2024, given everything that's going on in Israel, given everything that's going on college campuses, where the inclination seems to be the opposite. We seem to be moving into this protective mode, whether it's defending the war in Gaza, whether it's anti-Semitism in America, as opposed to basically saying, we as Jews carry a wisdom of 3,000 years. We want to offer it to the world as a way of taking part, being a part of a more humanistic vision of reality. And I just want to end with this final thing. Shakta Shalomi once wrote that the thing that was probably the most radical image that he ever witnessed that changed his entire understanding of what it meant to be a human being and what it meant to be a Jew was the iconic picture of the Earth from the moon landing. We all know that picture, right, of the kind of this beautiful blue ball floating in the sky. Because I think when he saw that image, he recognized that we all share this one space, this one very delicate, fragile space. And all of the different particularities that human beings have developed over the course of human civilization, if they can't contribute to the survival of that beautiful ball hanging in the sky, then they're really not worth anything. Thank you.
All right. Can everyone hear me? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Shaul. So now we're going to go to our next panelist, Roni Masel, who will be presenting on reading after Orthodoxy. Roni is assistant professor of comparative literature at UC Berkeley, working on Hebrew and Yiddish literatures and queer and post-colonial theory. Masel is completing a book manuscript titled Bad Readers, Misreading, Mistranslation, and Other Textual Malpractices in Yiddish and Hebrew. Masel turns her own OTD experience to theoretical advantage by arguing for the power, pleasure, and efficacy of OTD reading as a productive form of bad reading. Now I will welcome Roni to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Well, Nomi's not here, but thank you to Zalman and to all the folks at YIVO and everyone who's doing everything to make this happen. This is amazing. Okay, so I'll jump right in, and I say that I want to introduce you to my recently discovered hero, Moshe Aaron Lev. I don't have a photo of him, nor do I know much about him at all, but I do gather he was a passionate reader. He cared deeply about texts, about the truth, about the world, and he cared a lot when it came to the Russian Tsardom, and especially Tsar Nikolai II, whom he called the pig. And we'll get back to the pig. I encountered Moshe Aaron through a series of Yiddish inscriptions he left in a library book. That's a library book, signing his name on the inner cover. This book was read by Moshe Aaron Lev from Krinki, Grodno Gubernia, Grodno province, now living here in Cricklewood, London. What is it? Diesen Buch hat gelesen Moshe Aaron Lev, etc., etc. So I found these inscriptions in a copy of Sefer Shevet Yehuda Shalem, the Complete Scepter of Judah, printed in 1904 by the Vilna Press, the widow and brother Rum, or the famous printers of Shas Vilna. And this volume is now held in the collections of the National Library in Jerusalem. Though when Moshe Aaron read it, it was held in the collections, it belonged to a Jewish lending library in London's East End, the heart of London's Jewish working class at the time, in the early 20th century. That book is a patchwork of Yiddish translations and significant additions to, as well as omissions from, the 16th century Hebrew historiographical work, Sefer Shevet Yehuda. One of the additions was a Yiddish translation, or more accurately, actually an adaptation of another work entirely, the 17th century Hebrew chronicle, Yeven Metzula, or Abyss of Despair, which narrates the tragic events known in Hebrew and Yiddish as Gzeres Tachtat, or the Khmelnytsky Cossack uprising in Ukraine. And it is this part of the book, the Gzeres Tachtat part, that Moshe Aaron Lev cared most about, read most thoroughly, and vandalized most passionately. And I'll show you a few examples. But Moshe Aaron's multiple inscriptions, which included swears and violent threats, as well as a sense of shared intimacy with other readers of that same library copy, informs my exploration today with you of the pleasures, catastrophes, ruptures, and potentials of what I think of as reading after Orthodoxy, or bad reading, which is the topic of the book that I'm writing. So this version of Yeven Metzula, quite like the book as a whole, is a heavy adaptation of the original work that tries to instill in its reader, the adaptation that is, tries to instill in its readers a sense of loyalty to the Russian Empire. It's a weird project. I won't get into it, why at this odd moment at the turn of the 20th century, he decides to make Jews like the Tsars. It's odd. But in response, at multiple points, Moshe Aaron either strikes through the text or adds comments on the margins. So I have here some examples. But this is the example of one page that made him particularly angry. Where the editor blesses the Russian monarchy and praises Russian Jews' loyalty to the crown, Moshe Aaron began crisscrossing the entire page with his pencil. That's on the right-hand side. But on the opposite page, next to a mention of Tsar Nikolai II, Moshe Aaron wrote passionately, Jemach Shmoi v'zechoi aufgerissen werden, is so von das Land Russland kann sicher bleiben nicht, or may his name be blotted out, may it be torn apart, may there remain no trace of that country, Russia. Moshe Aaron then, yes, we'll get into our contemporary feelings about that land, Russia. But then he addressed future readers of the volume, and this is at the bottom on the left-hand side. And this is, I remind you, a library book, right? So he addresses readers of that same volume, writing, Les nicht den falschen Buch, verbrennt es. Do not read this erroneous book, burn it. However, rather than burning it, he ended up returning the book to the library, obviously. This is how I got it. But before doing so, however, he became a little more creative. And on another page where the editor comments again about Jews' loyalty to Russia, he struck through the word Russia or Russland and wrote in England instead, because he was living in London, and feeling a sense of loyalty to his newfound home. And finally, where the text relates to the Kaiser, that is to the Tsar Emperor Nikolai II, Moshe Aaron changes the letters Kof and Yod to a Chet and added an ayin instead, thus spelling out, or in fact misspelling the word Chazer, that is pig or swine, to describe the Kaiser, Chazer, Yirem Hoidoi, or may his majesty be exalted. All right, so surely Yiddish speakers had much juicier swears for the Russian Tsars than Chazel, and I do invite you to develop your own new ones, and in particular for a certain very contemporary Russian leader, as well as all of his authoritarian warmongering friends. But my question is, if and how Moshe Aaron's acts of vandalism could be helpful for us analytically. And there are a few things that I would like to explore, to consider in this story with you. So the first is I would like to think about his form of vandalism as an act of defiance, attacking the book not only as a material object, but as a social institution, criticizing choices made by the book's creator and breaking the rules of the London East End lending library in that process. And so this is the bylaws of the library that are attached just on the other side of where Moshe Aaron writes his name. And of course, the bylaws prohibit vandalism of books. And there's a nice paragraph about what to do if you get an infectious disease and you happen to have a library book at home, what you should do with it. And I just included it in the slides so you can enjoy it. And I'll soon talk more about what I mean by the book as a social institution. But second, right, so thinking about it as an act of defiance. And but second, I'm interested in Moshe Aaron's fascination with the texts about the catastrophe, texts that rely on graphic and gruesome depictions of brutality and horror. And that is because, as I'm about to disclose to you in more detail, this is a fascination I too shared as a young reader and frankly share until today. And third, and most importantly, I would like to highlight that Moshe Aaron's actions were not only destructive, but also constructive. That in his vandalism, he turned the library book into a site of unsanctioned communication. Rather than burning it, after all, he ended up returning the book to the library, where other readers, in fact, followed him in signing their own names. So right below his name, you can see another guy, for some reason, signed his name twice. I don't know, I can't read Latin cursive to save my life, but I'm told both lines say Solomon Goldberg. So, or also in offering their own forms of vandalism against the text, and I have two more examples for that. So, on the right-hand side, you can see a different form of vandalism. So on the right-hand side, on the top row, the vandalist scratched out the ink rather than striking it over, or crossing it over with a pen, etching it out, scrapping it out. And on the left-hand side, you can see vandalism with a different pen. So Moshe Aaron's vandalism was in pencil, and here we have another reader, maybe it's Solomon Goldberg, who also signed his name with a blue pen. So we have here sort of an expansive, infectious vandalism. The physical volume, in other words, became a site in which animosity towards the book's producers was exchanged in fact, infectious and expansive acts of vandalism. So the 3 points that I outlined will guide the rest of my talk today. And I'll leave that aside for now. So the first point was books and reading as social institutions and defiance against them. Reading taste and reading practice. Why is it that he turns to these specific kinds of texts? And the third is the break with tradition as a constructive and communal and communicative act rather than an act of destruction. So as I said, to answer some of the questions in the invitation to this event, like what do ex-Orthodox Jews have to offer the communities they join or those they left, or what resources they draw on from their Orthodox upbringing, I want to use these points drawn from Moshe Aaron Lev's case to share with you how my OTD experience has influenced my research and my approach to literature, to reading literature as a literary scholar. So let's start with the first point on private acts of reading as moments of rebellion and defiance against the social institution of books and reading. So I don't need to explain to this particular audience how Orthodox educational systems train their students to read a certain way, how they make us comply with certain approaches to reading, teaching a shared understanding about what one can or cannot do with texts. What I would like to remind us is that other social institutions like libraries, academia, the literary world, are equally invested in conditioning readers to read in certain ways. With the emergence of literature as a practice of mass culture, for example, intellectuals sought to train readers to adhere to rules of what they thought of as literary propriety. Different genres should be approached differently, right? You're not supposed to read an instruction manual for piety and devotion, or a liturgy for pleasure, or pulp fiction in order to edify yourself. One must read in a chronological order, right? Cover to cover, start to finish. Selective reading is prohibited. Physical books should be treated in a certain way, and so on. That academic training and scholarship also have their own protocols and procedures and traditions on how to interpret text and data are almost too obvious to necessitate examples. But paying attention to readers like Moshe Aaron alerts me to the fact that against these norms promoted by various actors, writers, publishers, translators, editors, librarians, educators, etc., readers always remain free agents, and this is really what guides me here, right? Readers do with texts as they wish. They misread, they plagiarize, they vandalize, they defy the expectations set to them as readers, and most importantly, they find pleasure where they aren't supposed to. To illustrate that, I wish to move to the second part, the second point I made about Moshe Aaron, his taste as a reader. His choice of reading materials, why he focused on the text on the catastrophe. So as I flip through the vandalized pages, skimming through graphic depictions of brutality during the Khmelnytsky massacres, I get sucked in. A memory comes to mind. Khmelnytsky. Yeah. A memory comes to mind. Shabbos afternoon, everyone's asleep, nothing to do. I pull out various books from the bookshelf looking for something exciting. The books of Kinnis, or liturgical laments, are particularly accommodating for my developing appetite. Bellies torn open and filled with feathers, children cooked by the hands of their own merciful mothers, the blood of the people of Israel spilled like water, heads decapitated, bodies piling up. Is all that revolting? Yes, it is. Is the history of anti-Jewish persecution and violence horrifying? Yes, obviously. But none of that stopped me from having a great time. I want to pause here for a second to note that the intergenerational trauma that was invoked during this conference a few times, in other words, is painful. But I want to deliberate on how the search for pleasure can offer ways to rework and challenge the political and often racist conclusions and orthodoxies that other modes of engaging with violent and traumatic past have presented to us as the only acceptable interpretation and the only acceptable conclusion, right? It's not lost on me that we are in a moment of terrible, unbearable suffering, witnessing an unparalleled devastation of Palestinian life and culture and peoplehood. And so the question becomes how we can envision new ways to deal with the narratives of brutality, right? With that violent past and present of violence. How we can find other ways of thinking about them and with them as we look into a different kind of future, hopefully different. But to go back to my reading journey, the books of the prophets were also a great source of pleasure for me. And those you could read in class, right, because you have the Chumash in the classroom, instead of listening in boredom to your teacher. Yael killing Sisra, excellent stuff, right? Ehud stabbing Eglon, king of Moab, until something spills out. This is what the biblical text tells us. And the medieval commentators argue if that word, Parshedona, is his guts that's being spilled out or his shit, and we don't know. But I can't put down the Mikraot Gdolot, right, the Chumash with the commentary. Rachab, who hosts the spies in the book of Joshua, is an Isha Zona, a prostitute. Then Rashi ruins my party by clarifying that, in fact, a Zona is not a prostitute, but a woman who sells food, which is a little bit disappointing, I know. But later on in the book of Judges, when we are told that Yiftach HaGiladi was the son of an equally Isha Zona, Rashi all of a sudden has nothing to say. I win. Many years later, I come to thinking that maybe studying Talmud would deliver me from my awkward predicament, and so I go to seminary. Late one night, I'm studying Chagiga with a friend when we stumble into a cross-reference that listed different pejoratives for the vagina in other tractates, like place of weakness, place of impurity, oisa hamokaim, that we saw yesterday in the film, as well as my favorite, lower beard, zakan tachton. It's a powerful encounter and a peculiar way to come to terms with one's own sexuality, right? I saw the female body there, both as my own and my object of desire, alienated and textually mutilated. I could read the Talmudic text, but was never to be its intended reader, right? And my desires could never align with those of the text. I was reading it from behind the mechitza, peeping into a conversation I was decidedly uninvited to join. But you're probably already guessing where this is going. After all, that sense of voyeurism in itself inevitably produces a very odd kind of pleasure. The point is that when you have a limited library, you make do with what you've got. You can read stuff into the text, out of it, read through it. You can change the focus. You can identify with the antagonist over the protagonist. You can misread and misinterpret intentionally. You can tear it out of context, or alternately read it so radically within context, read it so closely until the texture of the text eventually disintegrates completely. What I would like to argue is that those are important tactics, hacks, modes of workarounds, nonlinear makeshift reading techniques, particularly OTD techniques of reading, and that they are interesting and productive. They allow you to figure out your relationship to the text anew. No longer its adversary, nor its ally, neither its follower nor detractor, completely consumed by the text, but still somehow its master. To bring this towards conclusion, I want to go back to the third point that I made about Moshe Allen's case. That is, his acts of vandalism were not only destructive, but also constructive, for they turned the library book into a communal site of communication and shared experience. in the intimacy and seclusion of modern secular reading habits in which you're supposed to sit down and read quietly and on your own, the radical potentialities of reading so rarely receive proper attention. But our private moments of misalignment, misidentification, misreading, I believe, are something to be explored. In my research and writing about Hebrew and Yiddish literatures, I therefore focus precisely on these moments of misreading, and more broadly on what I think of as a range of textual malpractices, mistranslation, plagiarism, vandalism, graphomania, and so on. Such acts of literary impropriety are rebellious and revolutionary, iconoclastic as much as they are creative. And they are therefore productive for me because they reveal the force of textual instability and multiplicity, and they allow me to tell new stories of Hebrew and Yiddish literatures or in new ways and configure new angles to deal with the challenges posed to us as we write that history of those literatures. And so to answer the question that this event addresses, right, what does the OTD experience have to offer our wider communities? I want to say that I learned how to read through rebellion, through the experience of figuring out my way in a limited library, and that this common, very common OTD experience is something that allows me to question inherited traditions of reading, whether those traditions are those of the frum world or those of academia, right? And not only question them, but also kind of refurbish them and offer new ways out of intellectual, theological, epistemological, and social dead ends. I want to suggest that we think of the three aspects of Moshe Allen's vandalism, which I outlined, his defiance, his passion for the text, as well as his creative and constructive aspects of his vandalism, as OTD reading. It is this kind of reading sensibilities, that I lean to as a child, which I wish to cherish as a scholar, right? Rather than dismiss the childish, gleeful giggle at the obscene and the grotesque, right? Or the adolescent fascination with the forbidden, I propose that we give it proper attention, that we lean particularly into these sort of embarrassing, childish sensibilities. I propose that we give it proper attention as an OTD mode of reading, to give attention to the desire both for the text and the desire to undo the text, to relish in misreading it as a revolutionary practice, to honor what the organizers of this event have called OTD naches, a very specific kind of pleasure and intellectual exercise, neither fully divorced from traditional textuality, nor fully willing to subscribe to it, or in fact maybe completely unwilling to subscribe to it, refusing to subject oneself to the rigid boundaries of the Orthodox or traditional narratives and fictions about knowledge, training, and education, right? Whether those are of the Orthodox community or of academia. Moshe Allen's story is neither a tragic nor a triumphant story, and perhaps it is both. And so my proposition here is a mode of thinking about the OTD experience and the OTD engagement with the text that builds on the ruptured, pleasurable, and revolutionary prospects of reading after Orthodoxy. Thank you.
All right, so we're now going to take questions from the audience. Raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll come over with the mic.
Thank you so much. Those were both moving and interesting and just a pleasure to hear. Roni, I loved everything that you were saying. It felt inspiring for me. It felt in some ways quite new. It had me in mind of Jacques Derrida and deconstruction and what is the text doing behind its own back. And as I think back to my readings of women's stories of religious exit from a variety of different religions, so many of them, there was an undercurrent, an unspokenness through their stories of desire, of longing. And we spend so much time talking about what has pushed us away from our religious communities. And I'm just fascinated by what you talked a little bit about pleasure and desire and finding that, and that which pulls us into something new and maybe even to something delightful. And it seems like a part of your, I don't know if you would call it a deconstructive reading, but is looking for that hidden pleasure in the text. And I'd love to know more about what role you see this plays, the role of pleasure and desire in religious exit.
Yeah, that's great. I was thinking precisely about these things as you were talking yesterday. So thank you for that. Yeah, I think that you actually articulated it in an amazing way. We need to think about the things that pull us, not only that push us out, but pull us inwards into a new thing, but also to cherish and honor the pleasurable bits that we can carry over. There's that process of a breakage, right? Breaking out from the world that you left. We so often focus on the moment of rupture, but and on the things that we lose, right? When you lose your community, you lose social capital, you lose often actual capital or support, right? And so we tend to think about all the things that we lose, but I'm trying to think about the things that we can translate, that we can carry over, the baggage that is not only traumatic, but also the things that give us a sense of happiness, yes, of desire. And I think a lot about childhood in that context. Yeah, we were able to find joy in things, and what were they, and how can we carry them into the new arrangement in our life?
Hey, before I ask my question, I just want to give a quick shout out to Baruch Thaler. I know you mentioned him yesterday, Shaul. He's one of the founders in a lot of ways of this OTD movement here, and very innovative, and also Eli Moseson, who's not here also, both very instrumental people. If you haven't come across them, worth looking up, and I can offer some resources. Thank you, Roni, for that focus on pleasure. I think that's so powerful and important. The question I have, though, is for Shaul. Two things. When we were at Hartman, you also brought up this Reb Zalman piece of this focus on really, right, sending outwards, and the piece that you brought from '93, I think it was, from the press, right? So there's two questions. One is, do you see this as the integral kind of piece that Reb Zalman brought to Judaism? I know there's so many things, right? Is this the core of his teachings and what he brought? And the second part is practically, thinking about Masel's hierarchical, needs and so on. How do we, if we are constantly threatened at different points, how do we actually do that on a practical level, right? Like, how do we take that vision and do it when there is this rise in anti-Semitism all of a sudden, and there is, right? How do we do that on a practical level?
That's, of course, the operative question in many ways. I think, I don't know if I would say for him it was a core. It certainly was a fundamental oppositional resistance to the inclination of Jews to enclose themselves as a response to the Nazi genocide, of which, of course, as we know, Zalman came very close to, and I think really deeply influenced him in a lot of ways. How, in light of that, and in light of today, how can Judaism be unafraid of the world? And I think that for him, if it can't do that, it will have lost its core. Jacob Neusner, the renowned scholar of rabbinics and many other things, once made in a passing comment something that I think really I found is instructive. He said that if the Jew he said this in the 1970s, if the Jews can't somehow be able to process and overcome, not to forget, not to erase, but to overcome the trauma of the Shoah, then they will survive, but they won't be a very interesting people. And I think there's something in Zalman that carries that message also. Now, this is not discounting any of the issues that exist in the world that we live in, but my experience of his vision is that the most powerful antidote to animus against Jews is an expansive Judaism, a Judaism that reaches out to the world. Now, one can call that naive, but I feel like the retreat into a certain kind of survivalist mode, in however it takes in many different kind of forms, is not actually using the very resources that we as a people have. And it is a gigantic enterprise. It is countercultural, it's counterintuitive, it's dissonant. It's the opposite of the way we as human beings would react to the kinds of things that we're confronted with. And yet I think he would still maintain that that is the work that we have to do. Yeah.
So I was thinking about how Rashi is very easy to read differently because there's no nakudot, there's no punctuation. You can make words flow and tense them differently. And I used to do that every day in elementary school. So thank you for telling me it's a heretical reading all the way back then. And I appreciate these conversations and perspectives of how to look at things so differently than the way we were raised, and be okay with yourself for getting all the milim wrong on the Chumash test.
All right, we'll take one final question before ending.
Shaul, is it?
Yes.
Yeah, like a two-part question. So what do you see as the difference between heresy, as you describe it, and atheism? And how do you see Judaism without God?
Just a brief final question for. It's funny because if you want to go back to the rabbinic source of what we would call minut, which would be the closest correlation to heresy in the rabbinic corpus, it would be Elisha ben Avuya, who says leit din v'leit dayan, which in a certain sense, there is no judge and there is no judgment, which in a certain sense is a rabbinic expression of atheism of sorts. I just think that in a sense, while atheism might be an exercise in heresy, I don't necessarily think that it's a threatening one for those that live inside the orbit of Judaism. I think the more threatening one would be a reconstruction and reconsideration of the divine in a way that would justify or necessitate the rupture of normativity. That's threatening. to say that there is no God, first of all, I think that to say there is no God doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not going to do mitzvahs, right? There are many reasons to do mitzvahs. You just want to be a part of community. It's meaningful to you. In a certain sense, there is a way of articulating a Orthodox view of life that can say, what does God have to do with it? Right? Right. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I think on the atheism question now, Judaism without God. Judaism without God. People have been thinking about that for hundreds and hundreds of years. Somebody, I don't remember who, if they're in the audience today, showed me a copy of Isaac Deutscher's The Non-Jewish Jew, and which is a fascinating book. In a certain sense, the non-Jewish Jew is the beginning of a history of Jewish heresy, right? That the Jewish heretics are the real Jewish heroes. Deutscher himself was a Trotskyite, right? Wrote a 3-volume biography of Trotsky, and a Polish Jew who was in England. A fascinating person. So I think, what do we mean? First of all, and we have to enter a whole other conversation about what do we mean by God. And was Spinoza an atheist? No, he wasn't an atheist. In fact, Novalis called Spinoza a God-intoxicated man. The problem with Spinoza wasn't atheism. There was too much theism, right? Right? What he was an atheist, meaning that he didn't believe in the biblical God. He didn't believe in the commanding God. He didn't believe in the providential God, but he believed that we were all living inside of God. So when you talk about it in terms of belief in God, I assume you mean a covenantal God, a God that commands, a God that rewards, a God that punishes. And I think that Jews have not believed in that in all kinds of ways for millennia. It's not clear to me that the Zohar's God is that kind of God, that Maimonides' God is that kind of God. So I think that there is no static view of what God is, or normative view of what God is. God is, in a sense, always being manipulated, reconstructed, and Feuerbach, of course, was right that we create the image of God. If human beings are created in the image of man, we're creating the image of God. And there's nothing that's heretical about that. Jews have been doing that for a long time. The God of Leviticus is not the God of the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, right? Now, ostensibly it is, but if you look at it under a microscope, it's a little bit more problematic. So I think it's, as Arthur Waskow titled his book, it's about God wrestling, not only with God, but in how one understands God. And I think that's part of the process, that's part of the project that I think all of us are engaged with. I just want to say one more thing, just in terms of neat. There is another very interesting depiction of female genitalia in the Zohar, Zion. Think about that. Maybe take one more question, because I don't want to end on that.
I wasn't given the Zohar to read in elementary school.
Okay.
So.
That's why you weren't given the Zohar to read.
Shkayach. Big shkayach. Zion. Yeah, I have a few questions. We'll see what comes forth. I'm doing my master's right now, studying heresy and madness, and trying to come at this question of heresy through an anti-psychiatric lens that wants to situate the Bible and the discourse hermeneutically and psychoanalytically to provide context for the madness of the OTD experience. So I look forward to reading your works and being in dialogue. Yeah, I think presently there's this madness of Zion that's on my mind. And I am very inspired by thinkers like Reb Zalman about this like universalistic message, and then also feeling mad about Zion and feeling like sick that I come from a culture that is a part of the so-called holy war. Yeah, and I guess the question is, where does madness fit into this work of like Reb Zalman? Yeah, like where do we go from here? Like I think there's, on the one hand, I'm here for the hot take, like for the new takes of the Torah of saying like, oh yes, let's universalize, let's this, and then also growing up, like learning about how God commands us to do genocide and the like, like what do we? And of course, we could look at the Bible as a literary, as a history piece, but now it's it's used as a talking book for all of us. So.
Can I just suggest another term? I mean, I like the madness, and Tzvi Mark wrote a book called Mysticism and Madness about Nachman of Bratslav, right? So, right. And the other term that I think is worth thinking about in regard to the question that you asked or the comment that you made is hypnosis. And in the 1920s. There are at least two Jewish thinkers I know that I'll mention who were probably playing off of early psychoanalytic theory and used the term hypnosis. The first one is Aaron Shmuel Tamaris in his Knesset Yisrael U'Melchomot HaGoyim, uses this term hypnosis to argue that the Jews have been hypnotized by nationalism. And it's because nationalism is coming up through Western Europe in the formation of nation states and so on and so forth, and that for him Zionism was being hypnotized by nationalism to become like the nations. And the second iteration is an Aaron David Gordon, an early Zionist thinker from the Second Aliyah, who basically claimed, criticizing his the younger, Olim, that they became hypnotized by Marxism, and they thought that Marxism was the solution to the Jewish problem and the Jewish question. So this idea of hypnosis, in conjunction with madness, because hypnosis is a temporary state, right? And it's a state that's it's a state that's brought about by something outside that is magnetic or compelling, that ostensibly offers solutions to problems. But of course, it really doesn't, because when you're in a hypnotic state, you lose your sense of agency. That's part of what hypnosis is, for any of you that have been hypnotized. I've been hypnotized a few times. And it's fascinating. You don't lose consciousness. You lose agency. You're aware of what you're being asked to do, whether it's crawl on the floor or jump. You're being aware of being asked to do something, and yet you do them because somehow you have given up agency. And I think that's one way of thinking about the ways in which Jews or any collective gets kind of pulled and sucked into various things as responses to what are kind of intractable problems. So it might be another way to play it. And hypnosis was very much at play in the 1920s in the psychoanalytic world. Can I say one thing just about Roni's paper, which I loved? I think that what was so I think fascinating about it is really getting a window into how a person at a different period of time is engaging in the heretical enterprise of reading by being deeply invested in the tradition. Right? Not closing the book and say, oh, I'm going to go read Melville, but to actually work through hermeneutically, linguistically, with all kinds of word plays. That is, in a certain sense, the hermeneutics of heresy. And it's just a great window as an exemplar of what some of us do, what some of us want to do, what maybe we should do, what many of us have the linguistic skills to do, whereas many other Jews who did not have the experience that we had don't have those skills to do. So thank you for that.
All right, thank you, Shaul. Thank you, Roni, for those wonderful presentations and reflections. And now we'll have Zalman Nealfield come to the stage to offer some closing remarks.
Thank you, Roni and Shaul, for these wonderful papers. Thank you to everyone who participated, who contributed their genius, their creativity, their empathy, their feelings. I think so many people came over to me over the past 2 days and said how meaningful this conference and festival was. I think that a lot of us who are here in person, who experienced it on Zoom, will be spending the coming weeks and months thinking about it, reflecting on it, and for me, it's been just a tremendous experience. And I want to thank so much Naomi Seidman, of course, who came up with this idea and pushed it. And to all the amazing staff at YIVO who hosted us and made sure that everything worked out just as beautifully as it did. Thank you so much. I also want to be sure to thank all of our co-sponsors, the Hunter College Jewish Studies Center, the Footsteps here in New York, the Hillel organization in Israel, and the Social Science Research Council in Canada. Thank you all so much for making this possible, and thank you so much to all those who attended and provided such amazing questions and comments and support. Thank you all so very much. Thank you. Thank you.